Hello, and this week we come to the seventh Sunday of the Easter time, which really is the Sunday that lies between the remembrance of the Ascension of Jesus, which we celebrated this past Thursday, called Ascension Day, which, following our liturgical tradition, is 40 days after the remembrance of the resurrection. And looking forward in the next weekend, to the observance of Pentecost. And so these days between are kind of days of reflection. So it's with that in mind also that the scripture readings chosen for our consideration this time are also given. As you may know, just as an aside, the Ascension of Jesus on Ascension Day or Ascension Thursday, in some dioceses in our country that feast has been transferred to Sunday. However, in our northeastern provinces, dioceses, we keep the traditional observance. So the readings chosen, the first reading comes from the book of Acts, chapter 1, verses 12 through 14. So it's just two verses there. From the letter of Peter, chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. And from the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 1 through 11a. So let us begin by looking at the first reading. Now, in the story of the Acts, which you remember is attributed to the writer of the third gospel, namely Luke, the first chapter is a setup in terms of information that is given and activities that are described for the coming of the Spirit, which we will see next time, opens chapter 2 of the book of Acts. So, backing up a moment, let's look at chapter 1 of Acts. It begins with words again attributed to a man named Theophilus, who seems to be the patron of this particular work. His name also appears as the opening section of the gospel itself, so that is one way in which we certainly make the connection between the two works as being the product of one author. And then describes the ascension of Jesus. And those who may have celebrated on this past Thursday will remember that that was the first reading for that feast. Actually, Luke describes the ascension of Jesus twice. One at the end of his gospel, somewhat briefly, and then secondly at the beginning of the Acts. And it is a picture where Jesus is speaking to his disciples. As he is standing there, he is lifted up, taken by a cloud. Two men appear saying, "Why are you standing there looking up to what's happening?" Do what Jesus had said. And they then return to Jerusalem to wait for the coming of the Spirit. Now that's the background, the ascension story. Although this, if you remember this week prior, the gospel came from that of Matthew, because this being the year of Matthew, we need to take some sections from his gospel. And that gospel had pictured Jesus, again, as talking to his disciples, telling them that they were to bring the message to the whole world, and that they were to go out and to baptize all in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So there is no picture of an ascension in Matthew's story, but we do use Luke, as I mentioned, as kind of the example or the author of our understanding of this. Now, when the disciples return to Jerusalem, they go to an upper room, or as one translator puts it, to a high place. Well, I don't know how high a place they will go up. And it is there that the 11 are to wait for the coming of the Spirit. And how will they spend their time together? Well, they are to do it in prayer, fasting, and kind of getting ready in other ways for the gift of the Spirit. Also, and here we come now to the little section that we hear this time, and it is interesting to note that this is the year A. Part of that next section of Acts is given for our consideration. Next time, that would be year B, the continuation of the story of what happens in chapter 1 takes place. So all of that kind of putting things into perspective. What the reading that we hear gives us is a list of names, namely, and these would be familiar names. This is the second list of names that is given by Luke. Namely, here's how they are listed: Peter and John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. Now, this is the same listing with the exclusion of Judas Iscariot that one would have found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 13 to 16 of that work. So there is certainly a similarity, well, a sameness in terms of who the disciples are. And also included there, and he says the number is 120. Now we always have to smile a little bit. 120, if you divide it by 3, is 40, 40, 40, and that's always a number, as we know, for either preparation or testing or trying, whatever you want. But there are 120, and included in this group is named Mary. It is the only place in the Acts in which Mary is mentioned. This, of course, is the mother of Jesus. She is mentioned in the opening of the Gospel of Luke, in the 2 infancy narratives that we hear. But here she is presented, and this is the only time, as I mentioned, in all of Acts now, that she is mentioned. Pictures of Mary, of course, like to have her centered there. Well, perhaps. And also, there are other women in this group in the upper room, all right? It's a little hard to imagine 120 people jammed together in an upper room, even if it were a huge auditorium, which we suspect it might not have been, but if it were, well, that might have worked. But 120 people for some 10 days gathered together is ideal, but a little bit imaginative. Jesus, you remember, had ascended into heaven on Mount Olivet, and that was an important mountain. It is outside the city of Jerusalem. Interestingly, it's called a Sabbath day journey from Jerusalem. And then experts have said, well, what does that mean, a Sabbath day journey? Meaning that they could only move so far, and some have estimated this, get this, to be 960 yards, which would be appropriate number of steps that you could take on the Sabbath. So I give all this little background for this scene, both of the upper room, and to kind of finish up the ascension story. Although Luke gives an ascension of Jesus into heaven, it is not unique in Hellenic literature. It is unique in the New Testament. In fact, going back, Ovid, the historian of Rome, had pictured that Romulus, one of the 2 founders of the city of Rome, had ascended into heaven. Of course, in the Old Testament, one remembers Elijah had been taken up in a fiery chariot into heaven. And there's a story about a man named Enoch in a book that is parts of what is called the intertestamental literature, not included in our Bible, but which is often used for reference. And then Moses, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, had also entered into God's presence in a unique way. So all of that is background for this Sunday or weekend where we're pictured waiting. So why are the 12 and the disciples and Mary all waiting? Well, waiting for the gift of the Spirit, which Jesus had mentioned would be coming. So it's simply a little section, as I mentioned, just 3 verses, but important kind of to make the link between Ascension Day and Pentecost Sunday. Now, the Gospel, chapter 17, is sometimes known as the high priestly prayer of Jesus. In some ways, it is the final words that Jesus speaks before the beginning of his passion, death, and resurrection. So, again, the setting for this is at the Last Supper. As we've noticed, a couple readings previously have come from words that are attributed to Jesus on this occasion. This prayer of Jesus is more a proclamation or a thanksgiving, or as some pointed out, a concluding testament and farewell speech, much like Moses had given and blessed the tribes of Israel before he, of course, remember, did not enter the land of Israel with the people, but stayed behind, and thus the story of his death somewhere on Mount Nebo. Now, this particular chapter is divided into a number of 5 sections. Let me give you a little bit of this because it is a unique section of the Gospel of John. Some even suggest it may have been added, but it fits pretty well into all of the material that is Johannine. And here's how it is divided up. First, Jesus reflects on his mission, and he prays for his glorification. This would be verses 1 through 5. Then he reflects on his disciples, what he has done with them, why he has been with them. These are verses 6 through 8. Then he prays for his disciples. These are verses 9 through 19. Then he prays for unity of future believers and for the good of those who will accept the words of the apostles. And these would be verses 20 through 23. And finally, a personal invocation to the Father that Jesus makes. And these would be verses 24 through 26. Now, we're not going to hear all of those, but I give this a little bit to show the structure of this particular chapter as we put it and understand it in the Johannine Gospel. Jesus begins by saying, "The hour has come." Now, this stands importantly to remember that in the Gospel of John, the hour of Jesus is his hour of glorification. It's the hour when he will truly be seen by all who he is and what his relationship not only with the Father, but also his relationship with his disciples is all about. So, in the section that we hear this time, so we are hearing the first part, and in years B and C, the second and third part is given. So you see it's broken up. If you want to get the whole of it, you would have to look at the Gospel for each of the 7 Sundays or weekends of the Easter time through the 3-year cycle. So all of that, again, is a little bit of background. Jesus is pictured as saying, "I have finished the work that you gave me to do. I have made your name known. The words you gave to me, I have given to them." So it is Jesus who looks up as he says this. Now, he looks up into heaven. It's interesting, the Greek word here, into, not just looking up, but as it were, sees into the very place of the divine, into the place of God. So that is what Jesus is pictured as saying. Now, it's a self-identification in a certain way. He says, "Now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had in your presence before the world began." So in that sense, this particular chapter is sort of the bookend to the opening of this gospel, where you remember it had begun, in the beginning was the Word. This is in the prologue. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Thus the opening verses of the gospel. And then in verse 18, and the Word became flesh. So now we have gotten, if one notices this from the Johannine point of view, has an identification of what the mission of Jesus is. He has been sent by God. He has been with God. He is God. And so this is the gospel that brings that point to the fore. Just as an interesting aside here, there are, as we know, when we look at the person of Jesus, an understanding of who he is, two approaches, or what we call two Christologies. One is known as the descending Christology, and the other is known as the ascending Christology. Now the synoptics, that would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, support what those who look at the story of Jesus and the meaning of Jesus' life calls an ascending Christology. Namely, that what one finds here, and this is the way in which the gospel stories begin, even those with infancy narratives like Matthew and Luke, with discovering a person of earth who becomes, in the end, exalted to the right hand of God by obedience to his calling. So an ascending Christology says that the discovery of Jesus ultimately takes place not in his birth, but in his resurrection. Certainly death and resurrection are importantly linked together. And so notice why it is called ascending. We begin by discovering Jesus as a person, destined and determined to do the will of God as it unfolds in his life, and in the end, crucified, raised, and lifted up, or if one wanted, ascended into the glory of the Father. A different approach is taken by the fourth gospel, and that's the one that, by the way, tends to, over the course of Christian history, dominate a lot of thinking about Jesus, is called a descending Christology. Why? Because it, in a certain way, pictures Jesus as a visitor to earth. He was with God, and that he dwelt among us, and now carries out the mission that he has been commissioned with. That's why in this gospel, you remember, that Jesus is always in a certain way aware of things that are going to happen, even in some ways dictates or controls things that happen, or things do not happen until permission is given for them to take place. So a very different approach to understanding Jesus. He comes down out of the glory of God. He is the glory of God. And now, as he enters into his hour, so as I mentioned, this hour of Jesus is the hour in which he will be revealed for who he truly is, and will return to the glory of the Father. That is, thus one can see descending And you will say, well, isn't he ascending? Yeah, but he first came down and now is simply returning, but importantly, returning to the place from which he has come. Jesus, in the course of his ministry here, has revealed the glory of God. This is the visible or invisible radiance of God's presence or being, which is shown through the activities, through the works of Jesus. Notice that sometimes he says, if you don't believe in me, then indeed believe in the works, because the works I do are the works of the Father, and he has given me this task. In Jesus, the glory of God has taken flesh. And so in the person of Jesus, he hopes, and this is the purpose of somewhat of the gospel certainly, that his disciples will recognize that he is indeed the glory of God kept present among them. Now, as we hear this prayer of Jesus, and as I say, we're listening to the first part, and Jesus is pictured as praying here, the author kind of makes like the disciples are over here, kind of, oh, by the way, here is the prayer of Jesus, and invites us, that's the style he has, to enter into this mystic vision that Jesus is presenting in his prayer. So as I mentioned, the prayer of Jesus takes us back to the vision of the prologue, as we mentioned, with the sense of Jesus as the eternal, having eternal origins with the Father. So there, throughout this gospel, has been this most unique relationship of Jesus with the Father, and it's fair to say that that relationship seems to be a shared sense of divinity. Of course, when Jesus dwells among us, brings an important dimension of humanity or humanness, and that is part of our tradition, part of our belief. Now, the time frame, a little bit, in this particular prayer, is a little bit blurred because the discourse blends together a number of teachings of Jesus. He has said that he will be with his disciples for a little while, then he will not be with them, and then he will be with them again. Now, of course, in the Johannine Gospel, this pictures Jesus on the night of the resurrection as returning, having suffered, died, and been risen, returns with his disciples. So in a little while, I will be returned. But now, of course, the understanding is that that little while for Jesus' return again in glory is a time somewhere, sometime in the future, and that is yet to be known. So in listening to the way in which the Johannine Gospel is worded, Jesus is alternately here and there. He is before something and after something. He is above something and below something. Watch the language a little bit as you read this gospel and see how all these things kind of play out. It is a richly written and very deeply, in many ways, theological work, this fourth gospel. And we have been listening over the past weeks to sections from this gospel, as I mentioned, and it has played a very important role in the development of Christian thought. In fact, the idea of a descending Christology has for many, many centuries dominated Christian thought. As a result, you remember, of the first four great ecumenical councils of the Church, which met between the year 325 and the year 451. In those days, there had been also a considerable discussion about the nature of Jesus, But by the time that the fourth gospel, Chalcedon, in 451, concluded, the emphasis in reading the gospels, all four of them, was through the window or the vision of John. So you see, that's why I said this idea of a ascending Christology did not play for many, many centuries a strong role in how we understood Jesus. In more recent times, and we've noted this on a number of occasions, by paying a little more attention to the uniqueness of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have noticed that their understanding of Jesus, always that he is certainly united in doing the work of God and is one of us, but has a little different point of emphasis. Again, all of this is an aside, but something perhaps to keep in mind as we look at the gospel traditions about Jesus. Jesus' hour, as we notice in this gospel, rests on Calvary. Now, when it rests on Calvary, it does not rest on the suffering of Jesus. Certainly in no way do we not mean to indicate that Jesus suffered terribly, crucifixion, but the emphasis on the cross, and it goes to other words that one found throughout this gospel, where Jesus says, when I am raised up, I will draw all things to myself. So that in John's gospel, the cross is the symbol by which, or the trophy by which Jesus brings all humanity who believe in him and who accept his way into the fullness of the glory of God. And that's the mission that will be given to the disciples, that they too are, because of their belief in Jesus, to bring the glory of God to fulfillment. And so this is the hour of Jesus. He is lifted up. Keep in mind, I think we've mentioned this before, but perhaps just to conclude a little bit, notice that standing at the foot of the cross are two unique individuals, Mary and the disciple whom Jesus loves. Interestingly, the disciple is not named, but Jesus says to Mary, behold your son, and to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, he took her into his home. Also, as Jesus hangs on the cross in this gospel, when Pilate has given permission for the body of Jesus to be taken down, a soldier goes and breaks the legs of the two who were crucified with Jesus. But when he comes to Jesus and sees that he's already dead, sticks a spear into his side. We have certainly seen this picture, the wound of Jesus, very often. But what flow out are blood and water. And the blood and water flow downward. Obviously, even geographically, it couldn't go upward, but it flows downward. And who's standing? Again, Mary and the disciple. Blood indicating life, water indicating life. And so it is there in this picture that the church is born. And if during these days of between the Ascension and Pentecost, we're looking at the birth of the church in a very special way, that is a different approach that the fourth gospel is using. And as Jesus dies on the cross, in John's gospel, he says Jesus handed over his spirit. So you see, in John's gospel, what happens on Calvary is Jesus is raised, Jesus actually ascends, and the Spirit is given. So that's why the hour of Jesus, this is the hour of Jesus, his glorification, and in a very important way is reunited to that glory from which he came, on a descending vision. Jesus reunited with God, and the disciples and those who believe in the words of the disciples, and those who take the message of the disciples into the world, bring the glory of Jesus into the world. They themselves share that glory, and by their message hope that many others also will. Thank you for being with us this week. See you again.